Welcome. As president of Civitas, I welcome all participants to this seminar. As you know, Civitas Forum of Archives and Research on Christian Democracy is a platform of research institutions, archives, focused on researching and sources on Christian democracy, and we have English as our communication language. This cycle of webinars is a regular activity we held every year. Each seminar is devoted to discussing a recent relevant contribution to international research on Christian democracy. Each seminar is also available in direct streaming, so in the next few days, it may also be listened to from the websites of Civitas and the websites of the founding members, that is Istituto Sturzo, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and Leuven Kadok. This is our fourth seminar this year, after the three we had with Fabio Bolsonar, with Pepin Corduvener, and with Mark Gilbert and Piotr Kosicki together. And now we have invited Anna von der Goltz. I thank you very much for accepting our invitation to speak about this 2021 book on the Other 68ers, Student Protest and Christian Democracy. The theme is very relevant for us because the impact of the 1960s and 70s new social movements, that is students, women, third world labor, etc., is one of our recent major, I would say, interests. Our last conference, 2023, in Leuven, was exactly devoted to this. And the results of that conference highlighted as the Christian democratic parties had relevant difficulties in managing with this, I would say, deep turn in politics and society. Hence, we are very interested in listening to what Professor von der Goltz will tell us. Today, a few words of presentation of her. Anna von der Goltz teaches German and European history in Washington at the Georgetown University. And she has intensively researched on the political and cultural history of 20th century Germany. Her first book was on the Hindenburg myth, and the book won two very relevant prizes, the Wiener Library's Frankel Prize in Contemporary History and the German History Society and Royal Historical Society joint essay prize. As I have said, she's now working in Georgetown, but before she had postdoctoral positions in Oxford and Cambridge. This is all. Professor von der Goltz will have about 30-40 minutes for her presentation, then the audience can intervene with questions and with suggestions. So now the floor is yours. Anna, thank you again for coming. Please.
Thank you very much to the organizers for this kind invitation. I'm very pleased to be here, and actually want to preface my remarks by pointing out that I came to the topic via an interest in 60s protest more generally, not at first a primary interest in the history of Christian democracy. So I'm particularly pleased to be talking to this audience today and look forward to your questions. I'm just going to start sharing this presentation because I do have a few slides. Can you see?
Yes, we can see them.
All right, let me just play it from the start. Yes.
Yes.
So the reason I started working on the other 68ers was that I was quite intrigued by the fact that a central chapter of West Germany's post-war history seemed to exclude Christian Democrats and deal almost exclusively with the left, even though Christian Democrats had been and of course continue to be the most important political force in German history after 1945. And just to illustrate this, here's a slide of the sort of iconography of West Germany's 1968, the 60s more broadly. None of them, of course, or none of these images show any Christian Democratic involvement. Once I began looking for them, as it were, and as you'll see today, they weren't hard to find because they actually participated in many of the key protest events of these years and actually often shaped what was going on in quite important ways. So the book as a whole asks really a simple, but I think quite important question about one of the major moments of Germany's 20th century, namely what it was like to experience 68 on the other side of the political dividing line, as it were, as a student of the center-right. So the book in some ways, I think, returns to familiar territory, the student movement in the 1960s. But I think it examines a history that we know quite well, namely this one, from a perspective to which we had been relatively unaccustomed. The book is based on quite a few new sources from archives in Germany and the US. The focus are activists from the Association of Christian Democratic Students, which was, of course, a student group closely affiliated with the two Christian Democratic parties in West Germany. And I also include those who joined these new sort of center-right umbrella groups, the student unions, which were founded in the 1960s at many universities to answer the left-wing resurgence. So they are kind of the focus of the study. It's not an organizational history, though. The subject are very much activists, their ideas, their experiences, and their memories. And so one of the major sources of the book are oral history interviews. I conducted nearly 30 oral history interviews with former activists between 2008 and 2014. And the book tries to interweave their voices with the archival record. So the testimonies are used quite freely throughout the book, but they feature first and foremost as records of perception, as records of subjectivity. So the book is at once, I think, something of a collective biography of a group of people who dedicated their lives to politics, but it's also an in-depth study of the ideas and repertoires and trajectories of center-right students in the 60s and 70s. But rather than give you a sort of rundown of the book as a whole, I picked 4 examples, and I'll see if I have enough time to go through all of them. I might shorten it a bit at the end. But the attempt is to share some of the actual material and to make it a bit more lively. And the first of these took place in January 1968 in Freiburg, where the sociologist Ralf Dahrendorf, who was really one of the rising stars of the Liberal Party, the Free Democrats at the time, and of course one of the key thinkers of post-war liberalism, he held a spontaneous sort of open-air debate with socialist student icon Rudi Dutschke, who would only barely survive an assassination attempt a few months later. They were sitting on top of a vehicle that was equipped with a loudspeaker, and they laid out their contrasting visions of politics in the Federal Republic for several hours, surrounded, as you can see here, by thousands of people, most of them young men, actually. And this memorable encounter between Dahrendorf and Dutschke is very well known. It's often invoked in the scholarship and in commemorative pieces on 68 because it involved some of the era's best known protagonists and also reflected what's sort of considered the most important front line of the political clashes of these years. We've got Dutschke, the magnetic student rebel who called for revolution and really boldly challenged one of West Germany's chief public intellectuals, who was, of course, a staunch defender of the country's democratic institutions. And I think the visuals also contributed to the moment's longevity in public memory. There were numerous photos taken on the day. As you can see, most of the leading photographers of the Bonn Republic were in town to cover the Liberal Party's annual convention that was going on at the time. And I think the pictures sort of capture the quirky spirit of these years. We've got Dutschke in the leather jacket. We've got the suited Dahrendorf. They're sitting on this car debating. They're surrounded by cameras and microphones. And it really seems to illustrate the sort of urgency, I think, of political debate, of intellectual disagreement in these years. And it very clearly invokes notions of generational conflict between Dutschke, the 68er, and Dahrendorf, the kind of 45er, and therefore portrays 68 as sort of defined by the vehement disagreements between two quite clearly delineated generations of West German intellectuals. But I found out that the car was actually owned by a young Christian democratic student activist. So the car on which they're sitting had been used in local Christian democratic campaigns before. And the entire thing was co-organized by center-right students, by a man called Ignaz Bender and a guy called Meinhard Ade. You can see them on the photos on the right. Ade is the one in the middle, actually next to Dahrendorf. And on the picture on the right, you can see Ignaz Bender. They'd been involved in center-right student politics in the city. They were quite well known locally. And they're actually shown in many of the original photographs, including the one in the middle, which is also the one that features on the cover of my book. But as you can see on the left, which is actually the exact same photo used in a newspaper article, they were later often cropped out of pictures, like quite literally cut off. And so the story of this picture in some ways highlights the approach of the book as a whole. It writes Christian democratic activists back into the story by quite literally expanding the frame and showing that they'd been there all along. And the point is, of course, you know, that they participated, they belong to this history. This is the episode that the first chapter of the book opens with. And it was far from the only instance in which you can see the center-right participation, though. The first chapter examines other moments that were sort of similar. Here you can see the cover of a student magazine from 1965, which reports on Action 1st of July, which was really the largest student demonstrations the Federal Republic had actually witnessed to that day. 40% of the West German student population marched around this time to demand better funding for higher education and also kind of a merit-based restructuring of the entire education system. And the guy who organized all of this was Ignaz Bender, whom you can see here on the right, the same man I just showed you from that Freiburg debate. Also, a major student sit-in against fare increases in Cologne's public transport system that took place in October 1966, dubbed the Cologne tram riots, which actually culminated in the biggest clashes between protesters and the police that the city had seen since 1945. Again, this had been organized chiefly by Klaus Lepple, who was also a young Christian Democrat and the Cologne Student Council president. And I could go on, as I do in the first chapter of the book, but the point of these varied examples is really quite a basic one. It's to show that center-right students were present in and involved in 68, and not just as passive observers, or staunch opponents of protest, but often actually as quite central characters. So that's the first sort of case. The second one is not so much an event, it's really sort of a series of articles and critiques involving what we might term a sort of conservative or center-right version of feminism. And I just want to highlight this one article, which is not actually the one depicted here, but an article published in January 1969 called Housewife and Mother, Stereotypes of Femininity, which ran in a popular national Christian Democratic student magazine. And the anonymous author of this piece critiqued conservative and reactionary family ideologues and called for the overcoming of authoritarian and patriarchal structures. And this, the piece cautioned, should not be left up to extremist groups of the left. Emancipation does not equal revolution, the piece concluded. Now, constructivist readings of gender roles that critiqued the consumer industries and caused to smash the patriarchy are, I think, likely not the first things we would associate with Christian Democratic students in the 60s. And the third chapter of the book sort of asks what this sort of apparent embrace of feminist rhetoric actually means for our understanding of center-right involvement in '68. One activist I looked at more closely to understand this nexus is Ursula Mendle, who was one of the very few female activists who held a leadership role in the Association of Christian Democratic Students in the late 1960s. She was Bavarian state chair from 66 to 67. And I interviewed her. She's also written about this a bit. And while she generally framed her recollections of center-right activism around 68 as sort of anti-left resistance, I mean, that's a term many of them use, she also recalled in the interview that as one of the very few women in center-right student politics at the time, there had been for her sort of a certain experiential overlap with women of the left who were also subjected to quite a bit of casual sexism, even in student groups that advocated against other forms of political repression. And Mendle said she experienced much the same. When she joined the association in the mid-60s, she often felt marginalized. She told me the men led, women were also handing out leaflets and manning the stands, but when it came to discussions, only the men spoke. Women were really the exception. And of course, this story is well known in West Germany, as indeed across much of the globe. This kind of discrimination within these left-wing groups eventually sparked the formation of a broad array of autonomous women's groups sort of dedicated to fighting not just global imperialism, but also the patriarchy. And it's often celebrated as one of the enduring cultural legacies of 1968. And given how similar her experiences in the Association of Christian Democratic Students were, Mendle was increasingly curious about the politics of women's liberation, and this also began to affect her relationship with her male peers in her own political group. She began to criticize them openly, not least for making women's physical attractiveness a precondition for career advancements. And here is a quotation from a piece she wrote in the mid-1970s, where she says, "The physical downsides of female politicians were regularly discussed in a derogatory manner during nightly debates at the beer table, she with her drooping breasts. Has anybody ever asked the women whether they approve of the collection of more or less fat bellies, half-bald heads, etc.?" And this was, quite provocative. So she may have not thrown tomatoes at the men, as a left-wing activist famously did at the SDS convention in 1968, but she certainly hurled some verbal tomatoes, as it were. And there were strong echoes here, I think, of the arguments of some British and American feminists who were, of course, critiquing beauty pageants at the time as degrading cattle parades that reduced women to objects of male desire. And as I show in this chapter, in chapter 3, which deals with this in a bit more detail, she was not the only one to do so. The constructivist reading of gender roles, for instance, that second wave feminists introduced really made its way into more conservative circles. Even some fraternity publications now quoted Simone de Beauvoir and argued that any lingering differences between men and women were the products of early childhood socialization and not sort of naturally given. And I think this was quite a stark indication of how far the debate about women's issues had actually progressed since the 1950s, when there'd been this very strong societal consensus that had defined women primarily as mothers and sort of spiritual guardians of the family. And a number of center-right women later channeled their personal experiences of discrimination into scholarly work or into policy work, publishing or advocating on gender issues. And Mendele was actually one of them. Here you can see her as head of the Hans Seidel Foundation, the CSU's political foundation, which she chaired quite late in her career. And here she is sort of at an event promoting strong women. So I think these kinds of trajectories in some ways reflected a broader shift in the representation of women's issues. And, you know, when asked in 1988 to name the most important legacy of 1968, the Frankfurt School philosopher Jürgen Habermas famously said, Mrs. Rita Süssmuth, who was then the Christian Democratic Minister of Family Affairs, Women and Youth, and she was a proponent of a rather liberal family policy in the 80s. And he said, you know, a figure like her would scarcely have been thinkable prior to 1968. And she was, in some ways, indeed a prime example of sort of feminism's broad reach. In one of the first major interviews she gave after her appointment, she quoted de Beauvoir, talked about the great influence that the women's movement had had on her personally and politically. And left-wing critics at the time were really confounded by this brand of conservative feminism. They really couldn't figure it out. But I think in some ways, the early interest of a figure like Mendele, who I talked about, and some of these articles I mentioned, they show that Süssmuth didn't come out of nowhere, but she actually stood in a longer, if little known tradition. And I think that's one that perhaps also helps us grapple with the success of more recent Christian democratic women leaders, such as Angela Merkel and Ursula von der Leyen, which have similarly confounded sort of left-wing commentators. The third example, I mean, so far I've really talked very much about domestic politics, and I'll shorten this a little bit. But the book also moves us kind of beyond the confines of the Federal Republic. I do have a chapter on kind of the global imagination of Christian democratic students and their sort of involvement in what we might call, or what's often called, the global 1960s. One example I talk about is the campaigns for human rights, this turn toward international human rights activism that really exploded in the 1970s. And I try to also write Christian democratic activists back into the story of this human rights explosion, which I think is often portrayed as one that was really the result primarily of left-wing disillusionment after 68. If you read Samuel Moyn, Jan Eckel, and so forth, some of the leading scholars on the history of human rights, it's former leftists who realize that the revolution is not going to happen, and they are trying to find more manageable projects, as it were, and then actually start populating organizations like Amnesty International. But what I try and show in the book is that in some ways, you know, an organization like Amnesty International, whose motto was making the world a slightly less wicked place, was actually very much in line with center-right students' much more gradualist impulses. And it also allowed them to champion many of the topics that they had long since championed, especially sort of the dignity of the human person against the totalitarian collective, and above all, anti-communism. And so in the 1970s, you actually get a lot of human rights work that reinvigorates the long-standing center-right critique of socialist regimes in this now universally popular political vocabulary. The Berlin Wall, the 17th of June, 1953, are now very much kind of reframed as human rights issues. And anti-communism, I think, remained at the core of this kind of human rights activism. But Christian democratic students also moved beyond just critiquing socialist regimes. So much like Amnesty was all about political equidistance to the left and right, they were also kind of doing this. And the Pinochet regime in Chile became a primary target, as it were. And here you can see, for instance, a campaign for a young Chilean who disappeared in 1976. And he'd been the leader of the United Popular Action Movement, which had originally formed as a splinter group of the Christian Democratic Party of Chile. And throughout 1977, which was, of course, the peak year of campaigning for human rights globally, Christian democratic students ran this campaign calling for his release, alongside campaigning for the rights of a detained Soviet dissident. And so I think this shows that the sort of post-war conservative and Christian democratic version of anti-communist human rights here are being given a more self-consciously global and also in some ways ostentatiously apolitical form. And so in this sense, I think the Christian democratic students I'm talking about are not just part of West Germany's 1968, they are also part of the global 60s, the global 1970s, as it were. The final case I want to talk about changes tack a little bit. I think so far the story I've told is very much one of center-right engagement, of participation in protests, of spontaneous debates, women's emancipation, a global imagination, and so forth. So in some ways, you know, it's about them being part of the story and participating. And I think the final moment I want to highlight is qualitatively quite different, because it's about agitation, demarcation, and also in some ways about the vilification of one's opponents. And here you can see a scene from a broadcast on prime German television in January 1972. A popular right-leaning newscast showed scenes from this Spartacus tribunal that the Christian Democratic Student Association held at the University of Hamburg. And viewers saw its national chairman, Gerd Langgut, whom you can see here, speaking on a heavily barricaded podium while he was being drowned out by shouts from a really visibly enraged student audience. You can see these specks on his sleeve, that's curd. Students had been throwing stuff at him and shouting him down, and they also eventually stormed the podium. And he had sort of organized this tribunal to really show that the Spartacus, which was the student organization of the West German Communist Party, was a threat to the constitution. They had primed the student audience with lots of leaflets before, asking provocative questions, which guaranteed a full house, and then this enraged student audience. And the student audience really behaved in ways that seemed to confirm the worst stereotypes about left-wing radicalism. You know, there was a sort of all these displays of intolerance, as I said, eventually storming the stage. And I think this was, in effect, kind of a piece of political performance that offered the audience a kind of reenactment of the Weimar Republic, because it really illustrated the dangers of extremist passion. And Langgut styled himself as the archetypical militant Democrat who remained cool and composed in the face of this left-wing onslaught. This, so it was very much reason against irrationality that was on display here. And it was a stunt, I think. It worked extremely well, not just inside the auditorium, is in the days after this broadcast, I found lots of letters in the Bundesarchiv, which show that the Federal Minister of the Interior, Genscher, and also Willy Brandt, who was then Chancellor, actually received numerous letters from television audiences who, who were really outraged by what they'd seen. These were letters written by lots of kind of ordinary Germans, housewives, high school teachers, artisans, some blue-collar workers. And they then invoked the specter of the Nazi past to sort of make sense of what was going on, and painting students as basically the new Nazi hordes, while at the same time, and I think this is quite revealing, also using kind of distinct Nazi vocabulary to talk about students, calling them work shy, suggesting they were Bolshevik agents, and so forth. And so in some ways, the letters, I think, reveal that there was a really close proximity in the sort of imagination, in the sort of Cold War moment, that mixed the Cold War present with the wartime and post-war past. And I think also illustrates some of the ways in which this Christian democratic student agitation brought much older and often actually much uglier resentments against the left to the fore. And I connect this reading of the Spartacus Tribunal with sort of a broader discussion of center-right agitation in the 70s that really helped to focus the public debate on domestic security and left-wing kind of sympathy for terrorism. So I talk about the radicals decree and the center-right's support for this piece of legislation that basically subjected applicants for the civil service to a political loyalty test. This Spartacus Tribunal I showed you was shown on TV the night before this ordinance was debated by the relevant authority. So it was very much kind of an attempt to influence that public debate. I also show that center-right students were centrally involved, in fact, in the so-called Mescalero affair, which was a sort of scandal about student support for the Red Army faction. And I think this is important because a lot of this has traditionally been interpreted as kind of an intra-left dispute about free expression in a liberal democracy, about surveillance, about the political obligations that come with public service, and the role that Christian Democrats actually played in pushing the social liberal coalition toward adopting a really hardline stance towards the radical left has been highlighted far less often, I think, but it was actually a crucial element of the story. And so I think Christian Democrats really helped to stoke public hysteria about a left-wing radical threat in an attempt to paint the governing Social Democrats as kind of soft on communism. And they were the vanguard in many ways. They were often the first to sound the alarm about this stuff and sort of explain the public obsession with kind of students as terrorist sympathizers. Here you can sort of see a cartoon that in some ways mocks this public hysteria in some ways, where you have the student 78 along with Dracula and King Kong. This is not to suggest, of course, that the radicalization of the left or left-wing terrorism were just the stuff of right-wing propaganda. Of course not. These theatrical productions in the end worked only because the left did them the favor of playing along and turning up to these kinds of events and behaving as intolerably as predicted. But it was also a technique. I mean, the Christian Democrats at this point really sought out the centers of left-wing activity, adopted a very much a prosecutorial and quite hyperbolic rhetoric, which was designed to provoke. And so I think they helped to create, or at least to escalate, a situation that they were supposedly committed to fighting. And so, you know, this shows in some ways that it was not just the radical student left or the social liberal coalition that displayed a liberal streak in the 1970s. I think the conduct of Christian democratic students in the 70s also underlines that this idea of 68 just leading to liberalization also doesn't quite work in that case, that there was also you know, a liberal element here, and that linear narratives get us only so far, that we've got to imagine a lot of this as a far more winding process of change. But let me come to my conclusion and just sort of point out what all of this means and what I think it adds up to. Does any of it matter in the end? I mean, do histories of 68 gain anything by expanding the frame, as I have done, to include Christian democratic activists? And of course, my answer is yes. It would be strange if it weren't. And I think that three important historiographical implications, and I'll just sketch them very briefly. I mean, first of all, and I think this has probably become clearest, writing these activists back into the history of 1968 and its afterlives, I think shows that this was a much broader and a more versatile moment politically, and as a result, also a more consequential phenomenon in some ways than the traditionally narrow focus on left-wing activism allows. So one goal is actually to assert that 68 mattered, so much so that it even really affected the center-right. So it's kind of a way of stressing or reasserting in some ways the importance of 68 as a moment in post-war West German history. Secondly, I think the book really highlights that we need to rethink how we conceive of generations in German history, and the 68 generation in particular. Germany is, of course, often portrayed, understood as the country of generations, because the many ruptures in its 20th century history made the experiences and attitudes of different cohorts diverge much more strongly than in countries with more continuous political traditions, say Britain in the 20th century. And in German history, I think focusing on generations has allowed historians to write about changing political systems on the one hand, while also bringing in individual biographies. And so it's been quite seductive in a narrative sense. You can write about big structural change and people at the same time. But one downside of this approach, I think, is that it tends to generalize the experiences of a particular subset of a cohort and to portray them as the universal characteristics of all those who were the same age. So to put it quite simply, I think in many generational histories, we've got one uniform generation succeeding another, which leaves very little room for understanding kind of diversity or even division within these cohorts. And I think my approach offers something of a corrective here. And in the case of 68, I mean, that in particular has been written as the history of intergenerational conflict. And I, of course, show that it's not just about conflict between different age groups, but it's also about a confrontation between the young, between Dutschke and Meinhard Ade, who are pictured on the cover, not just between Dutschke and Dahrendorf, as it were. So conflict was indeed key to 68, just not in the way that we have assumed, or at least not just in the way that we have assumed. I think in a conceptual sense, even though I am inspired by Karl Mannheim's traditional model of political generations, I also move significantly beyond it. It, of course, famously privileges the experiences of bourgeois, male, politicized intellectuals who very much like talking about themselves, which makes it very tempting for the historians to take their interpretations as their own. But I think, you know, one reason I try to include activists who played important roles in the 60s, but who were perhaps more hesitant about giving their experiences generational forms, such as women, such as renegades, if we want to call them that, who ended up on the other side politically. I mean, the idea is to, you know, to show that these stories that especially the men tell about themselves later on don't always capture the entirety of the experiences of the original group. And so I think in that way, the approach here also yields new insights. And I think that has the potential to do the same for other periods of German history and even beyond German history. And finally, I think by foregrounding the role of center-right students around 68, I also, you know, help to revisit the extraordinary role that Christian Democrats have played in the history of post-war Europe and of West Germany in particular, perhaps. And many newer works on Christian democracy, of course, don't treat it as a sort of straightforward restoration of traditional conservatism. Of course, it wasn't. It's a remarkably flexible and dynamic ideological formation that actually shared more common ground with the left than once assumed. And I think, you know, the book builds on many of these insights and expands upon them. Many of my protagonists would go on to pursue fairly high-profile careers in politics and in policy, and really left their mark on West German political culture, I think, especially during the Kohl government of the 1980s. And I think their embrace of kind of a certain liberalism on social issues actually goes some way towards explaining why the return of Christian democratic rule in the 80s did not in the end transform West German society as thoroughly as many observers had expected, as some had even feared, depending on where you stand politically, of course. These former student activists, as I argue in the final chapter of the book, sort of championed a winning political formula of relative liberalism on social issues to kind of capture the values of a changing electorate, but combined with effective resistance against the party's left-wing opponents that really helped to delineate quite a robust political identity and that helped to mobilize core voters. And this, I think, helped the CDU-CSU win in 82, 83, and to recapture political hegemony after more than a decade in opposition. And so I think the book also helps us to understand kind of why the age of Christian democracy may have been interrupted in the Federal Republic, but never actually ended, right? And I think the upcoming elections in February are likely to show that that is still true. And I think the people I write about are, you know, perhaps not the most important, but certainly one element in understanding this longevity of Christian democratic politics in the Federal Republic. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you, Professor von der Goltz. Very complex, ambivalent, very interesting picture. We have now time for discussion. So I will ask everybody in the audience to raise hands, and in case make intervention. I have myself many questions, but I would prefer to listen from the audience before. No raise hands?
I see one.
Do you see one?
I see one.
It's mine.
Okay.
So,
Peter, welcome.
Well, nice to see you all. And what a great lecture you gave. I really enjoyed your paper and your conference. Many thanks for that. I have a rather small question. When I compare the protagonists that you describe in your conference, they made me think also on the let us say the younger generation that was active in the Belgian Christian Democratic Party throughout the 70s and the 80s. You label them as activists. I would like to know which definition you use for that label, because most of those people to which you refer, for the Belgian case in any case, were active within the party. So their involvement on the broader level, even intermingling with the student protests at the end of the end of the 60s, was a little bit in the slipstream, may I say it like that, may I phrase it like that, of their involvement in the youth sections of the party itself. And I was wondering if that was also the case for Germany, so that those activists, as you label them, with the center-right identity and with the Christian democratic profile, was their activism linked or anchored down, let us say, in their institutional involvement within the party, and then specifically within the youth sections of the party?
Yeah, great question. So my definition of activism is a rather loose one. It's people who dedicate a significant part of their time to political work, kind of beyond just sort of writing things. I mean, there has to be some kind of physical presence at events, some sort of activity involved. And I think, yes, I mean, many of the people I talk about are members of the Christian Democratic Student Association. Not all of them in the late 60s are also members of the Christian Democratic Union or the CSU. Many of them sort of join later on and then have these party careers. But I do think in the late 60s and early 70s, the word activist does capture what they do, because some of them, I mean, one protagonist described himself as something of a vandal who would follow the left, wherever it went, and was basically present, at all these moments that we've read about. He would kind of go and do the counter speech and, distribute flyers and so forth. And there are also some personal relationships, right? So, I mean, a lot of them have stories about sharing drinks with Rudi Dutschke and actually sort of debating at the bar later on. And Dutschke's widow writes about one guy I interviewed in her biography of Dutschke, and says we really respected him. He always showed up. He really sort of enlivened the discussion. He made us smarter as well. And so, yeah, so I think definitely in the late 60s, it's an accurate term. And the party careers, I mean, the last slide I showed you with what became of some of them, that's the later career. And at that point, I don't know if I would still call them activists or politicians or policymakers. That might be more accurate.
Peter?
Thank you. So,
okay, great. You have nothing to add, I think, imagine. Perfect. More raised hands? I have my question too. It is, as I said, your picture of the situation is so rich, ambivalent, and complex. It makes great sense. That is direct participation on the one hand, a lasting influence on the other of the movement on those people. At the same time, a sharp contrast with the radical left of the movement. Well, this corresponds to the situation in other countries, not only to the German one, but for example, also to the Italian and to the Belgian, as we have just heard. But this leaves me a problem. This is my question. How do you interpret, what kind of interpretation you give for the 1968 movement as such? Because in our normal perception, this was an anti-repression movement in any sense you can give to the word, anti-repression, one of the famous song of the age for among the many, but one of the most famous was Donovan Leitch sang Rules and Regulations. This was against any rule and regulation. So what kind of interpretation you give this, and in which way you locate this center-right student participation to the whole movement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it depends, of course, on, or at least partly on how you understand 68. I mean, I think that the historiography of protest in the 60s and so on, it's moved beyond just focusing on kind of student groups that had particular platforms or, you know, the most radical elements. And if we kind of see it as a broader moment of cultural, political upheaval, I tend to see it exactly as this vortex that kind of, you know, drew in a lot of different groups and people and ideas, and then also threw them out in different directions, right? And I think then it becomes easier to think of them as a part of it. And I think, as you alluded to, I think my interpretation of the relationship to the broader movement is a complex one. It also is context dependent. So I think in the mid-1960s, it's much more a story sort of 65, 66, up to 67, much more a story of, you know, moving in tandem in a way and sort of a joint beginning. And I think there is a sort of broader sense that the West German democracy that has been built since the war has certain shortcomings. And so the analysis has quite a bit of overlap, like in terms of what's wrong. And then when it comes to actually fixing things and proposing solutions, of course, Christian democratic students are reformists rather than revolutionaries. And they play with this contrast. I mean, you get a lot of this language of revolution versus reform, or the reform as a revolution in a tolerable dose and so forth. So they play with a lot of this. And I think the demarcation and sort of antagonism that builds over time, sort of after 67, 68, in the West German context, it becomes harsher. And then in the 70s, it's really no longer a story of participation and engagement. It's much more a story of, you know, I mean, I call that chapter, it's called Combative Politics, because it's all about clashes and kind of the struggle. And I think that encounter in the 70s of this very strong, harsh confrontation, vilification, I think that sometimes gets back projected into the 1960s. It's almost as though the joint beginning and the participation got buried by the 70s story of antagonism and a focus on violence and so forth. But so it changes over time. But the anti-authoritarian, I mean, that's probably the term I would use for the movement as a whole. There's certain elements of that very much also capture what young Christian Democrats feel in terms of the relationship to their own party, older figures within the party, society as a whole. I mean, and it's stronger for some, you know, for the women. I mean, I thought that, you know, that came out very clearly, that it's some of the same sorts of experiences, always, of course, in a far less radical key. But there is, you know, something of a joint beginning, I would say.
Very, very, very interesting, very, very convincing. Yeah. Probably there was also sort of radicalization after 1968 of the whole movement. So
exactly.
The beginning was not
No, exactly. And in the beginning, I mean, really, at almost every major event, you still have protests or whatever they're usually there. In the 70s, I mean, that's pretty unthinkable. I mean, you know, rather, I mean, there are quite a few physical clashes. Almost every center-right activist has stories about physical confrontations as well, and that's not, you know, not something you find as much.
Really stand. Help me, because I do not see it.
Florian Bock, if I'm pronouncing.
Yes,
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your presentation.
yes.
Good afternoon to
Welcome.
all. And yeah, grazie Renato. And their connection to the activists. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, I think that given that it's, you know, the Christian Democratic student, little of it in a direct way, most of the protagonists I talk about are, of course, socialized in religious institutions. Many of them go to confessional schools, the particular till Catholic, I would say. So, I mean, that's a stronger Catholic influence. But I think this broader story of secularization, even though, of course, we've got to be, you know, canon, I do think it's sort of mirrored in what goes on here. They have these fairly tortured debates about what to do with the sea. It's always, you know, and to what extent does the sea still matter? I think the strongest influence in a sort of positive sense you can find in those campaigns for human rights, which I think very much built on personalism and a lot of these sort of, but, you know, I mean, they campaign to make the contraceptive pill available to unmarried students. You know, there's a lot of nudity, sexual explicitness, and so forth in their magazines. And so I think in a social sense, this is more a story of a secularizing party. And in a theoretical sense, it's about how to reinterpret this heritage. Fewer and fewer members of the electorate, especially the young people who are, of course, you know, this is also the moment having to speak to young people is, of course, a primary concern, in the sense that many of them are leaving the church, or at least much less influenced by, especially, I think in some ways less important, but of course it doesn't disappear.
Thank you. May I add a question that was raised? Florian was present at the last conference I just mentioned in Leuven in 2023 about social movements and Christian democracies. And one of the interesting aspects that came out from the conference was that there was a great role of the churches, in the case of the Catholic one, a great role of the Second Vatican Council, and that a large part of the mobilization of young Catholics in the direction of the protest movements was just, did you find anything of this kind in your research or not?
I didn't, but it may be, you know, maybe a result of sort of where I looked, because I obviously focused on universities, and also was, of course, drawn to centers of activism, right, where there was a lot sort of going on, and then trying to in it, or the response to it. And there I didn't see as much of a footprint. But I think this is also, I mean, this is why I prefaced the remarks by saying I came to this from an interest in 60s protests.
Yes, you just mentioned this process of secularization of the party. So probably it was not the case, absolutely, because those young people, they wanted to be secular more than officially Catholics. So
it did, and they are upset. Exactly, and they are obsessed with value change. You know, in the 70s, they all read Engelhardt, and they all are sort of trying to understand the changes in Western societies more broadly, but of course, specifically with reference to their own electorate. And I think there is sort of a sense that these kinds of appeals to one's identity as a Christian, as a Catholic, or as a Protestant, I mean, there is sort of a sense that these don't work as well, and they've got to find different ways of appealing. So part of it is no doubt strategic, but I think also in terms of how many of them live, and certainly what you read in the papers at the time, there was, you know, relatively little in these magazines about, you know, the encyclical in 68. And I mean, you know, when you read about the pill, it's trying to get it to more women. It's not necessarily grappling with you know, the Pope.
Yes.
Ideas on it. So but yeah, I would be extremely, I mean, I wish I could have come to the conference. I'm extremely keen to see if, you know, there are any sort of publications associated with it, and just to you know,
We are
when
working on it.
Yeah.
We are convinced that it was very good.
Yes, no, it sounds that way, because when I started working on this, I mean, there wasn't very much, right?
No,
on
absolutely.
comparative cases, and then you know, and some of it is no doubt also languages that one reads, but I mean, this would be a tremendous comparative project, I think. And I wrote a kind of a follow-up piece with a British colleague for a volume on conservative and Christian democratic parties in the Nordics and parts of Western Europe, and we're doing a comparative piece on the UK, the Federation of Conservative Students and Christian Democrats. So, I mean, I think that yeah, there's great potential, I think, for comparative work here.
Absolutely. I don't see if there are any more raised hands.
Everyone
Are
is
there?
black square.
Because I cannot see.
Yeah, no, I don't see any. No one has a camera on, so it's hard to see.
I don't know if there are somebody else want to ask something. We have more or less 10 minutes more, not more, but we have them. But it seems not. Well, I think. Oh, yes. Laura.
Hi, I'm Laura Ciglioni. I'm not able to raise hands here,
Okay.
but so if I may, first of all, apologies because I have been able to join you just while your lecture started. So I'm very sorry if I'm asking something that you already mentioned, or if this is slightly off topic. But I was wondering, what's your take on the issue of disobedience as a core virtue of democratic citizen that started to be part of education schools in Germany, I would say like mid-1960s, late 1960s. I'm thinking of the works of Sonja Lepson and how she was trying to pinpoint the fact that in reaction to what was perceived before as an authoritarian way of teaching and structuring schools in Germany, there was this movement from the late 1960s about making disobedience a core virtue of citizens, but interestingly, not as individuals, but as a group that would act that way towards the whole of society. So I was wondering, if you found anything about this in your researches, what was the take of young Christian and Catholics and Christian Democrats in regard to this? And if you think that this has played any role in their long-term success, this became like an embedded value for society more at large. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. And I'm a big fan of Sonja Lepson's work. But So not in a sort of direct way, but similar sort of discussions are, of course, going on. There was a famous text that 3 Christian Democratic student leaders published in response to the killing of Benno Ohnesorg in June 1967, which was, of course, kind of the key moment in the West German 60s, the student movement, and it really grappled with this question of state authority and whether a form of resistance to it and dissent more broadly is warranted. And they come down very strongly on the side of, it's our civic democratic obligation to critique authority and to stand up to police violence, even when it's, state representatives. But, this actually is a sign of democratic maturity in West Germany, not a sign of democratic values being endangered by this kind of disobedience. So kind of an embrace of disobedience. And then there's also kind of in a more habitual kind of cultural sense, like if you look at some of the way that they dress, long hair, much more relaxed sort of clothing at some point starts. Wolf Schönbohm, who was a student leader, he also plays with a leather jacket and this sort of rebellious image. So there is, this one piece I showed at the end, Die Zeit calls him, a bit tongue-in-cheek, but they call him the Lenin of the CDU and so forth. And, some of it is performative, but there are elements of this, which I think also, plays with this idea of sort of contesting authority. So I didn't necessarily find a huge engagement with, this kind of literature on, say, children's education or civic education and so forth. But there is a sense that, that thinking critically about authority, and then also in reverse, actually defending state institutions with more than, the sort of hint at, we're the ones who get to decide. They try to almost intellectualize and theorize kind of authority in a different sense, to say, we have to have the better argument. It's not just about insisting that we get to decide. It's also we have to persuade, right? Which I think links to this question of disobedience. And so definitely engagement with this.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't know if there is anybody else unable to raise his hand, but willing to intervene. I ask them to make themselves visible. And perfect, Marta.
Good evening.
Good evening.
First of all, thank you for your speech. Very interesting, and I found many similar aspects to the history of long 60s in Italy. But I would like to know more about how the West German students you studied interpret the events of Prague Spring during the 68, and how they deal with the contradiction that this event, I think, could generate in their activism. I don't know if it's clear, the questions.
I didn't get the very last point. So the contradiction that this event could generate what?
Yes, about the totalitarian and anti-totalitarian power. I don't know, but I think the difference between the states in East and West Europe, it's very clear. So yeah. I would like to know how they reflect about these differences, or if they reflected about this. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, they did. So in this chapter on kind of mental maps and the global imagination, as it were, I talk about Prague and just sort of understandings of what's going on in the Eastern Bloc more broadly. And I think in some ways, it's much easier for Young Christian Democrats, the center-right more broadly, to grapple with what's going on in the Eastern Bloc, especially after the intervention, especially after the Warsaw Pact invades, because of course it confirms the repressive nature of the Soviet Union and communism more broadly. And so they have demonstrations that they take part in. They also commemorate the intervention. So in 78, it's always remember Prague and so forth. So they think about it quite a bit. But in general, and I've done some related work on East and West German leftists and their sort of attempts to understand each other across the Iron Curtain, which were often, they were very interested in each other, but it was often quite difficult precisely because of these, different political languages, very different repertoires. And so in some ways, a bit of a dialogue, not quite of the deaf, but at least if people operate in very different systems and have these different rooms to maneuver. And I think for the center-right, it's in some ways much easier. It fits their sort of conception of what's going on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And they report on dissidence as a phenomenon, right, in the Eastern Bloc quite a bit already, prior to the Prague Spring, about different kinds of music groups, different kinds of things. They also go to Sofia, to the International Youth Festival in '68, and they actually hold up pictures of Dubček, which is kind of really bizarre. You have young Christian Democrats from the West, holding up pictures of the Communist Party leader, and the West German left is involved in shouting about Mao and, shouting down this kind of reformist. So yeah, some of these allegiances are kind of in some ways counterintuitive, but I think it links to, or sort of represents, the complexities in some ways of Cold War politics and youth groups who are at once critiquing the Cold War binary, but are also sort of part of it in different ways. And yeah, so it's very important, and I talk about it not at length, but it's it's part of this one chapter. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know if there are other people who want to.
And perhaps as an addendum, and I think this is sort of maybe the German peculiarity, where anti-communism, of course, it's present throughout the Western world and Western Europe and so on, but because of the division, it does have particular salience, I think. And it also means that young Christian Democrats are kind of suspect within their own party, right? Party leaders are sort of saying in internal meetings, these are all Stasi agents, right? They can't be our own youth group. These must be communist infiltrated. And one of, I found one guy who later does become a Stasi informant and becomes a communist, has this very interesting trajectory. It goes from, leading Christian democratic activist to communist and informal collaborator actually in the West. So they weren't like completely imagining some of this stuff, but I think, the situation is even more sort of intertwined with what's going on to the east of the Iron Curtain because it's a divided country.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Marta, have you anything to add?
No, thank you.
I don't know if there are others who want to intervene. I do not see any raised hand or.
Great, it's only 10 to 10 here in DC, so I get to kind of have a full rest of my work day.
Well, I think we may conclude here our meeting. I have to thank again Professor von der Goltz This was a wonderful conference. I have to thank also all the people who intervened. The discussion was very interesting. These 2 hours passed, at least for me, very easily. It was very, very interesting and fascinating to hear you. I hope we could stay in contact in the future. This is our last web seminar, Civitas web seminar for this year, but we'll have a new series of 3 or 4 seminars in the next one. So stay tuned for the dates. We will continue to provide you with the information, and we will try to follow to this enriching and thought-provoking conference with new others. So thank you again. I hope to see you soon again with us.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for the questions.
So bye to everybody.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.